The coffee had gone cold. I hadn't noticed until I picked up the mug and felt nothing but a chill against my palm. Funny, how grief does that. It steals the small things first: the taste of food, the warmth of a drink, the ability to sit in your own kitchen without feeling like a stranger in someone else's house. I set the mug down on the counter and stared out the window at the frost-covered backyard, at the bare oak tree my sister Ruth had planted the spring after our parents died. She had said that tree was for us, a living thing to prove that something could still grow after everything fell apart. That was 32 years ago. Ruth was gone now too, and I was standing in my kitchen on Christmas Eve, trying to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. My name is Gerald. I am 64 years old. I spent 22 years as a homicide detective in a mid-sized city in Ohio, and I have seen things that would hollow out a lesser man. I know what real evil looks like. I know how it moves, how it disguises itself, how it shakes your hand and smiles at your funeral. What I did not know, what I could not have prepared for, not with all my years on the force, was that the worst evil I would ever encounter would be sitting at my own dinner table. Ruth was my only family after our parents passed. She was 4 years younger than me, sharper than a tack, and stubborn as river rock. When I was out on the job, pulling double shifts and chasing monsters through the worst neighborhoods in the city, she was the person I called. She talked me down from the ledge more times than I can count. She drove 3 hours in a snowstorm to sit with me the night my marriage fell apart. She was the one who showed up. Always. No matter what. Known. She married a man named Dennis Calhoun when she was 38. I never fully warmed to Dennis. He was the kind of man who filled every room with the sound of his own voice and somehow said nothing worth remembering. He came with a son from a previous relationship, a boy named Trent, who was 12 when they married and who grew into a man I trusted even less than his father. Trent had his father's easy smile and cold eyes, having the kind of man who remembered every favor he ever did for you and forgot everyone you did for him. But Ruth loved Dennis, and I loved Ruth, so I made my peace with it. She died 18 months ago. A fall, they said. She had been home alone on a Tuesday afternoon, and she had apparently slipped on the hardwood floor at the top of the stairs leading down to the basement. The medical examiner ruled it accidental. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. Dennis had been at his brother's house that afternoon, a fact his brother confirmed, and Trent had been at work. It was, by every official account, a tragic and senseless accident. I buried my sister on a gray Thursday in November and told myself that the world was simply cruel and random and that good people fell downstairs and that was the end of it. But something had been sitting in my chest since the day she died, a small, cold stone of unease that I could not dislodge. It was the detective in me. It would not sleep. Not. Say. I had looked at every detail of the official report. I had asked quiet questions that I told myself were just a grieving brother's need to understand. I had gotten no answers that satisfied me. And eventually, I had done what I always told myself strong men should do. I let it go. I was wrong to do that. I have a nephew on my wife's side, my late wife, Carol, who passed from cancer 6 years ago. His name is Marcus. He is 23 years old, Carol's sister's youngest boy, and after Carol died, he latched onto me in the way that young people sometimes latch onto older ones who understand loss. We were close. He called me Uncle Jerry even though the technical family connection had dissolved the moment Carol did. I never corrected him. I liked the sound of it. Marcus had been close to Ruth too. She had a way of collecting people, of making anyone who sat at her table feel like they had always belonged there. After she died, Marcus grieved alongside me. He started coming around more. He would sit in the kitchen and drink coffee with me, and we would talk about her, the way you do when someone is gone carefully at first and then with something that almost feels like joy. He was quieter than usual that Christmas Eve. I noticed it the moment he walked through the door. He hugged me the way he always did, tight and brief, the hug of a young man who has been taught that emotion should be quick, but his eyes when he pulled back were wrong. Red at the rims, a tension in his jaw that he was working hard to hide. I asked him if he was all right. He told me he was just tired from the drive. I did not believe him, but I let it sit. 3Z. Dennis and Trent were coming for dinner. That had been the plan. Ruth's first Christmas gone. and Dennis had suggested we all spend it together in her honor. And I had agreed because I thought it was what she would have wanted, and because I still believed, at that point, that the two of them were simply men who had lost the same woman I had in different ways. The dinner was uncomfortable in the way that all dinners are, when grief is the uninvited guest. Dennis was loud, as always, filling the silence with stories about a fishing trip and a neighbor's new truck and the price of lumber. Trent ate steadily and said little, which was unusual. He was typically as loud as his father. He kept his eyes on his plate. He poured himself 3 glasses of wine before the main course was cleared. Marcus helped me in the kitchen after we ate, the way he always did. We moved around each other in comfortable silence, wrapping leftovers and running water over dishes. Dennis and Trent had drifted to the living room. I could hear the television murmuring. I remember thinking that the house felt wrong without Ruth in it, that her absence was a physical thing, like a piece of furniture removed from a room you'd memorized with your eyes closed. Marcus set down the dish he was drying. He set it down slowly, deliberately, and when he turned to face me, his jaw was clenched and his eyes were full of something I recognized from 22 years of looking at witnesses who were about to tell me something that terrified them. He reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out his phone. He didn't hand it to me right away. He held it in both hands, looking down at it, like a man holding something he wasn't sure he should have picked up in the first place. "Uncle Jerry," he said, and his voice came out in almost a whisper, "I need you to listen to something, and I need you to stay calm. When you do, I looked at him for a long moment, and the detective in me woke up all at once, sharp and cold, and completely sober. "Show me," I said. He pulled up an audio file, his smartwatch. He explained in a low, rushed voice, the one I had given him for his birthday, 2 summers ago, had been on his wrist the last time he had visited Ruth. 3 days before she died, he had been at the house for lunch, and Dennis and Trent had shown up unexpectedly. There had been an argument. Marcus had left to give them privacy, gone out to sit on the back porch. But the watch had stayed in recording mode from a workout he'd done earlier, and hadn't properly stopped. He hadn't known. He hadn't listened to any of it until 6 weeks ago, when he was going through old health data on the app and saw a 40-minute audio file from a date he recognized. The date Ruth died was a Tuesday. The argument had happened on a Saturday, 3 days before. He pressed play. I will not describe everything I heard on that recording in detail. Some of it I am still not ready to put into words. What I can tell you is this. I heard my sister's voice, sharp and frightened, telling Dennis that she had spoken to a lawyer. I heard her say that she knew about the account he had moved money into, the one he had set up 6 months after they married, without telling her. I heard her say the words, "I am not going to stay quiet about this anymore." I heard Trent's voice cut in, ugly and low, telling her that she needed to think very carefully about what she was doing. I heard him say that she had no idea what she was getting into. I heard my sister say, clearly and without wavering, "Get out of my house." And then I heard Dennis's voice, quiet in a way that was worse than shouting, say, "Ruth, you need to stop and think about what happens if you keep pushing." The recording ended there. Marcus had come back inside, and the watch had finally shut off. I stood in my kitchen on Christmas Eve with the sound of my dead sister's voice still hanging in the cold air, and I understood with a bone-deep certainty that had nothing to do with hope or assumption and everything to do with 22 years of reading the truth in the spaces between what people said. I understood that my sister had not slipped and fallen. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected to shake, to fall apart, to make some sound. And instead, everything inside me went very quiet, the way a city goes quiet in the first minutes of a blizzard, everything muffled and still and suspended. "How long have you had this?" I asked. 6 weeks, Marcus said. His voice broke on the second word. "I am sorry, Uncle Jerry. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. They're in the next room right now, and I've been sitting at that table for 2 hours trying to figure out how to." "You did the right thing," I said. "You did exactly the right thing." I looked out through the kitchen doorway at the living room. I could see the back of Dennis's head above the armchair, the television light flickering across him. Trent was somewhere out of sight. Everything in me wanted to walk into that room. Everything in me that had ever stood over a crime scene and felt the particular cold fury of knowing what had been taken and who had taken it, all of it, wanted to move right now, to confront, to demand, to make them look me in the eye and say it. But I had been a detective for 22 years, and I knew what happened when you moved too fast. Evidence got complicated. Lawyers got creative. Men like Dennis and Trent, men who had already survived 18 months of scrutiny and come out clean, did not break easily. They needed to be cornered. Properly. Irrevocably. I told Marcus to keep the recording exactly as it was and not to tell anyone. I told him to act normal for the rest of the evening. I watched his face process the weight of that request and then watched him square his shoulders and nod. He was Carol's blood through and through. She would have been proud. The rest of that evening was the longest performance of my life. I sat in the living room with Dennis and Trent, and I talked about football and the weather and the price of gas, and I kept my voice easy and my eyes steady, and I did not let one flicker of what I knew cross my face. Dennis laughed at his own jokes. Trent refilled his wine glass one more time and stared at the television. When they left at 9:30, Dennis pulled me into a hug at the door and told me that Ruth would have loved this, all of us together, keeping the tradition alive. I smiled and said she would have. I closed the door behind them and stood in the hallway for a very long time. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked. Not loudly, not visibly. I had not spent 2 decades in a homicide unit without knowing how to move quietly, inside an investigation. And 9. Testa. I called a friend, a former colleague, a woman named Paula who had taken a position with the county prosecutor's office 2 years before I retired. I told her what I had, and I told her what I suspected, and I watched her face on the video call go from careful skepticism to something much more serious. The financial trail was not hard to find once someone with the right tools started looking. Dennis had taken out a life insurance policy on Ruth 14 months before she died, a policy he had never mentioned to her family, a policy that paid out a figure significant enough to explain a great many things. The account Marcus had heard Ruth mention in the recording had received a transfer from a joint asset 2 weeks before her death. The attorney Ruth had apparently contacted a woman in a neighboring county who specialized in family financial disputes, confirmed that Ruth had made an appointment and then canceled it the week before she died. She had sounded frightened on the phone, the attorney said. She had asked whether her husband could access her communications. Paula called me on a Thursday evening and told me that her office was moving forward, that a detective I had once trained would be handling the case, that I should stay out of the way and let the process work. I did not stay entirely out of the way. I made one phone call that I will not apologize for. I called Dennis and I told him that Ruth's estate attorney had found some irregularities in the filing, nothing serious, just paperwork that needed signatures, and would he and Trent be willing to come and meet at my house on Saturday afternoon to sort through some of her documents together? I told him I had found a box of her things. I thought they should have. I told him it would mean a lot to me, doing this as a family. He said, of course. He said, absolutely. He said it in the warm, uncomplicated voice of a man who has no idea the ground has already given way beneath him. They arrived at 2 o'clock on Saturday. Dennis in his good coat, Trent with his hands in his pockets, both of them looking at me with the practiced ease of men who had been performing innocence for a year and a half and had gotten very good at it. I had made coffee. I had set out a box of Ruth's things, photographs, a few of her books, some Christmas ornaments she'd collected over the years. I let them sit down. I let them settle. I let Dennis pick up a photograph of Ruth from a beach trip we'd all taken 12 years ago and say, with what I was certain he believed was genuine feeling, God, she was something, wasn't she? She was, I said. I put my phone on the table. Paula had told me the officers would arrive within minutes of my text. Marcus was sitting quietly in the corner. He had asked to be there. I had said, yes, and I had said yes. I want to play something for you, I said, before we get to the paperwork. Dennis looked at me pleasantly. Trent's eyes moved to the phone. I played the recording. I watched Dennis's face across the full 40 minutes of it. I had seen guilty men hear evidence against themselves before, many times, in rooms much less comfortable than this one. I knew what to look for. The first thing that goes is the color. Then the stillness, they stop performing and just exist, stripped of the social machinery they've been running for so long. Then the eyes begin to calculate, searching for an exit, an explanation, a version of events that can still be shaped into something survivable. Dennis did all three, in exactly that order. Trent said nothing for a long time after the recording ended. Then he looked at his father. That look told me everything I needed to know about where the weight of this really lived. That doesn't prove anything, Dennis said finally. His voice had changed. It was thinner. That was an argument. Couples argue. She wasn't arguing with her husband, I said. She was telling two men to leave her house. 3 days before she died. That left. I found it was not. It was an accident, Jerry. The medical examiner is being asked to take a second look, I said. So is the insurance policy you took out on my sister 14 months before she fell down those stairs. And so is the account you moved $40,000 into the week before she died. The color had finished draining from Dennis's face. Trent pushed back from the table as if he meant to stand, and I held up one hand. I wouldn't, I said simply. 22 years of authority in 2 words. He sat back down. I sent the text. Dennis started talking then, the way men do when they have run out of road. He talked about how the argument had gotten out of hand. He talked about how Ruth had come at Trent first, which was a lie. I let him finish without interrupting. He talked about how they had panicked afterward, how they had never meant for things to go so far, how it had been an awful accident and they had made a terrible choice, but they were not bad men. They had just been scared. I looked at him the way I had looked at 100 men in interrogation rooms over the years, and I said the same thing I always said in those moments. Save it. The knock at the door came 4 minutes later. The investigation took 6 months. The medical examiner's second review, aided by information from the recording and the financial records, resulted in a reclassification of Ruth's death. The life insurance payment had been suspended pending investigation. In the end, Dennis took a plea: voluntary manslaughter, financial exploitation, obstruction of justice. He would serve 9 years with the possibility of parole. His attorney argued that the push had not been premeditated, that the fall was an outcome no one intended. I sat in the courtroom and listened to that argument and kept my face absolutely still. Trent was charged separately with obstruction and conspiracy. He was convicted at trial and sentenced to 4 years. He sat in the defendant's chair on the day of the verdict and would not look at his father. I went to both sentencings. At Dennis's, he was permitted to make a statement before sentencing. He looked at me from the podium for a long time before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was the voice of a man trying on grief like a costume and finding it did not fit very well. I loved Ruth, he said. I want Gerald to know that. I loved her. I let him finish. The judge looked at me briefly, the practiced neutral look of someone who has witnessed many of these moments. I did not stand. I did not stand. I did not speak. When the sentence was read and the bailiff moved toward Dennis, I picked up my coat and I walked out of the courtroom into the gray January morning, and I stood on the courthouse steps and I breathed the cold air and I let myself feel, for the first time in 18 months, the full weight of what had been taken from me. Ruth was gone. Justice being served did not bring her back. That is the truth of it, that no one tells you that when you finally get the answer you've been living without, when the machinery of consequence finally moves in the direction it was supposed to, the grief is still exactly where you left it. It does not get smaller. It gets clearer. And somehow, that is both better and worse at once. I thought about all the times she had driven through the snow to sit with me. I thought about the oak tree in my backyard, bare now, midwinter, but still rooted, still there. Marcus drove me home from the courthouse. He was quiet for most of the ride, the way he had learned to be quiet, in a way that still took up space, that still said, I am here. Carol had been the same way. He had her quality of presence, that particular gift of sitting beside someone in their pain without trying to fix it. You okay, Uncle Jerry? He asked when we pulled into my driveway. I thought about the question honestly, the way I had learned to do late in life, when you stop having the energy to answer the way people want you to. Not yet, I said, but I think I will be. He nodded. He came inside and we sat in the kitchen and he made fresh coffee and we talked about Ruth the way we hadn't in a long time, not carefully, not around the edges, but directly, with the full weight of her name in our mouths. We talked about her stubbornness and her cooking and the way she could silence a room just by raising one eyebrow. We talked about the oak tree and what she had said when she planted it. Something can still grow after everything falls apart. I do not know yet if I forgive Dennis. I have spent a great deal of time sitting with that question, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what lives underneath. The detective in me says forgiveness is not the point. The brother in me is not sure. What I know is this. I chose to let go once, 18 months ago, when something in my chest told me not to. I chose convenience over truth, and I called it strength. I called it strength. I called it. I will not make that choice again. The oak tree is still there in my backyard. It budded last spring, the first spring after the trial. I stood at the kitchen window one morning in April and watched the pale green appear at the tips of the branches, and I thought about Ruth's hands in the dirt, and I let myself cry in the way I hadn't allowed since the funeral. Without pulling back, without composing myself, without the soldier's training or the detective's remove. Just a brother, just a man, just grief, doing what grief does, when you finally stop managing it and let it move through you like weather. Marcus is applying to law school. He told me last month, sitting in the same kitchen, and I watched him try to be casual about it and fail completely, the excitement breaking through in spite of himself. He wants to work in victims' advocacy. He wants to be in the room for people who don't have someone to be in the room for them. Ruth would have had plenty to say about that. She would have cried and then pretended she hadn't. She would have made him a cake and called him remarkable and embarrassed him thoroughly and meant every word of it. I told him he was going to be extraordinary. I told him Ruth would have agreed. Truth does not expire. That is the thing I have carried with me from 22 years of the work, and from the 18 months of living on the wrong side of a lie that had eaten through my life like rot through a foundation. The people who buried it believed they had buried it permanently. They built a year and a half of ordinary life on top of it, dinners and holidays, and a man sitting in a courtroom being told to save it. They were wrong. They are always wrong. Because somewhere, a young man is going through old files on a smartwatch app on a quiet afternoon, and somewhere, a brother who spent a career reading the truth in the gaps between words is still listening. And some things that fall down do not stay down. Some things, eventually, find their way back to the light.